All right, as you can see, there's a race, LaGriz, that Professor Steele's running in. So he left this up for you guys to take a look at. But I thought it was a nice picture of a bear. It's in Montana. So, all right. So last time we were talking about the economic theory of tort liability, and we were going through what you had to show in order to sue somebody on a tort. And the idea of tort, of course, was that you have transactions costs. I can't bargain with you about, oh, gee, can you not slow down so fast because I'm about to crash into you, right? So the idea of tort liability is really dealing in general with accidents. And of course, what do we want to do is we try to minimize, right? We want to minimize that social cost of accidents. That's the whole, right? There's a social cost. And we said that you got two things going on here. One is that the probability of an accident declines with precaution, right? So the probability of an accident goes down as, we'll let precaution, we'll call precaution X, goes up. So there's a cost to undertaking precaution. Like we said, you could drive, everybody could drive 5 miles an hour when they're driving home for a break or driving home after school's out. But there's a cost to doing that, right? There's an opportunity cost to your time. But the slower you drive, the less chance of an accident. And so there's this trade-off that's going on. So if we look at the X being the amount of precaution and probability of the accident happening being P, right? So what is this? This is declining, right? So if I had something that looked like this, I would have that if we had in dollars here, what would happen is the probability is going down, and what is the expected value of the accident, right? You guys just did on the midterm expected value, right? It's the probability times the value. So suppose that we say the A is the cost of the accident, okay? So if A is the cost of the accident, then what's the expected value of the accident, right? So the expected value is, right, the probability, which is a function of X, and times, probability is a function of X times A, which is the cost of the accident. So if we were to put the amount of precaution here, and we were to say, okay, what's the expected cost of the accident? It's going to look something like that, right? It's good downward sloping. And what we want to do then is notice that there's this reduction in the probability as the precaution goes up. And so the expected value is going to be going down, which tells you that that's what? That's a negative function, right? If we took the derivative, that thing would be negative. But there's also a cost of precaution. So if we were and of course, all we're doing here is we're doing Rod Stewart's every picture tells a story, right? So we're just telling a story. What's the picture? The story that we said is that, what is this picture saying? This is the story that says that the expected cost of the accident is going to be declining as X goes up, that is the amount of precaution goes up. This thing is equal to the probability times the cost of the accident. And we're simplifying right now to make the cost be independent of the actual cost of the accident being independent of the amount of precaution. Like the cost, we're just taking that as a constant, right? So, so we have the cost of precaution here, but then what's the cost? The cost of precaution, let's say it's constant, some constant number times x, right? So that's the cost of production, where W is some number in dollars, just as A is some number in dollars, just to simplify the algebra, okay? So what's the total cost of avoiding the harm is going to be the sum of these two, right? It's going to be the sum of the precaution cost plus the expected cost of the accident. So the total cost is going to be Wx plus P of x times A. So if we were to draw this picture, right, that picture would look something, right, that looks like that, right? That Wx is the cost of taking the precaution. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to minimize the sum of the two, okay? So if we were to minimize this, I'm trying to minimize the sum. And if we were to add these two up, and what's our picture going to look like? Our picture is going to look something like that, okay? And there's going to be some x star, call it x star here, that minimizes the social cost, which is equal to Wx plus P of x times A. So if we just do the algebra of that thing, what are we going to do? We're going to take the first derivative and set it equal to 0, right? If you're trying to minimize a function, you take the first derivative, set it equal to 0, or if you are doing it just sort of thinking about it, I'm going to increase precaution as long as the added cost of the precaution is less than the added gain, in a sense, or the reduction in the expected value, right? Do things as long as the added benefit is bigger than the added cost, you keep doing it. So I'm going to keep doing x, I'm going to keep increasing precaution as long as what I'm adding to my cost side is less than the benefit that I'm gaining on the expected loss. Okay? So if I were to do that, what do I have? I have Wx plus P of x times A, and if I'm going to minimize this, I could take that first derivative, and I'm going to get W plus P prime of x times A, because A is a constant, right? And if we have P prime of x just being the derivative of the probability measure with respect to x, I'm going to try to minimize that thing, right? So I'm going to do this, and that's going to be set equal to 0. So when we do that, what do we end up with? We end up that W is equal to minus P prime of x times A. Notice that this is a positive number, right? Because P prime is a negative, right? P prime is a negative. And so the P prime of x, is negative. So minus P prime of x is going to be positive, so there are two positive numbers there. Okay? So again, not just every picture tells a story, but every equation tells a story. Okay? What does our equation just do? Our equation said, okay, I want to minimize this thing. If I take the first derivative and set it equal to 0, I'm going to minimize that thing. But what do we end up with? We end up with what we just said before, that this, which is the additional cost to precaution, is just going to be equal to the additional benefit in the sense of lowered expected loss when I undertake that precaution. So let's now think about what are we trying to do? We're trying to get the law to make it so that we get the most efficient outcome, right? I mean, that's the whole picture of the class is what are we trying to do? We're trying to say, using economics to say, okay, people are going to respond to incentives. Can I structure the law so that the incentives are likely to end us up where we'd prefer? And we can always, in some sense, we can find the optimal amount, right? Right here, we know what the optimal amount is, but that's just because we've got some equation. How do I actually end up doing that, right? I mean, that's sort of the problem all along the way. But let's take a look at what are some of the incentives under two rules, right? One rule is no liability, which says you crash into somebody, no liability, right? So what will happen? Well, what's your instinct going to be? Your instinct's going to be is that the potential victim is going to undertake their efficient amount of precaution, right? Because they know they're not going to get anything if there's an accident, so they're going to undertake efficient precautions. So if you were to think about it, the victim bears the full cost under no liability. Okay? So the victim bears the full cost. So what are they going to do? They're going to set, just like we've been talking, right? They'll set the marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. And go ahead and erase this piece. So what's going to happen? Well, they're going to set they're going to set that thing such that the wage, it's not the wage, I'm thinking of labor economics, so that the marginal cost of the extra precaution is just equal to the expected reduction in the loss to them, which is the optimum thing for them to do, right? So they're going to, from their perspective, the victim is going to minimize that, the social cost to the victim, okay? So they've minimized the social cost to the victim, so what does that say? If we have no liability, then the victim is going to take efficient precaution. Okay? Now, what if you had a different rule which says, do you have strict liability? This is another rule. Say, we'll make that rule number 1. And rule number 2 is strict liability. And you have perfect compensation. What does strict liability mean? It means that you caused the accident, you got to pay compensation. Doesn't matter what the victim was doing. Okay? So strict liability says the injurer must fully compensate the victim. Well, if the injurer has to fully compensate the victim, just think that in the first case, I'm going to put sand, if there's a potential flood, right? There's, I'm going to do what? I'm going to put sandbags around my house, or I'm going to do something, right? Or I'm going to get anti-lock brakes put on my car, or something like that, right? So, if we look at that's probably not a good example, right? Because I probably put anti-lock brakes on my car so I don't crash into somebody, right? So that wasn't a good example. Anyway, you can think of an example where you're undertaking precautions so that things don't, you drive slowly. Okay, we'll go back to you drive slowly, right? So if we look at strict liability with perfect compensation, then what happens? There's no reason for the victim to take precaution. And why is that? What's the cost to them, right? They've got Wx plus P of x times A, right? That's their total cost. But what's that thing? That thing's 0, right? Because they're going to get perfectly compensated if there's an accident. So P of x A is equal to 0, right? Because they get compensated. So where is that thing maximized, right? Wx is maximized where x equals 0, right? So it just says that if the rule is strict liability, you run into somebody, you cause the accident, you got to fully compensate them, then the people that are potential victims aren't going to take any precaution. So you got so if we look at the two rules that either you have no liability or strict liability. Under no liability, you're going to get the victim to take efficient precaution. Under strict liability with perfect compensation, then they're not going to undertake any precaution. So now you can look at, well, let's look at what the precaution is for the potential injurer, right? So now we can look at So now let's look at the incentives for the potential injurer. Go back to our two rules that we could pick, right? Rule number one. Rule number one says that we're going to have no liability. Well, you're going to get a similar story, right? With no liability for the person that is the potential injurer, then you're going to get the same situation as you got strict liability with perfect compensation on the potential victim. So with no liability, what's going to happen is I got the injurer has no incentive to take precaution. And why is that? Because they don't have, again, this Px times A is going to be 0, right? All right, because they don't have to pay. So what are they going to do? They're going to maximize the total cost of them by setting Wx equal to 0 or x equals 0 because W is a constant, okay? So under the no liability, then you're going to get a injurer's not going to take any precaution. Now what happens if you have strict liability? So 2, I got strict liability. It says, hey, you know what? You caused the accident, you got to pay everything, right? You got to fully compensate the other person. So what's the expected loss, right? And now it's P of x times A. So what am I trying to do? Again, I'm trying to minimize Wx plus P of x times A. And so what did we say that's going to be? We're going to be where W is equal to minus the first derivative with respect to x, P prime of x, times A, times that constant number. So you're going to undertake efficient precaution. So the injurer, in this case, right, the potential injurer undertakes efficient precaution. Well, think through what's the problem here. Problem is I want both of them to undertake precaution, right? I want you, when you're driving, I want you to slow down when you're getting to where a crosswalk's going to be. But on the other hand, I want you to look both ways when you're going to cross the street, right? I want both parties to undertake efficient precaution. What's our problem? Our problem is either rule ends up with only one party taking efficient precaution, right? So I've only got, under either a strict liability rule or a no liability rule, I got only one party takes efficient precaution. So how can I make it so that we get the efficient amount of precaution? Because the cost to society, think about what the cost of society is. It is, let's let WV equal the cost of additional precaution by the victim, and WI equal the cost of additional precaution by the potential injurer. And then you have the probability of XV XI, which is the probability of the accident, with XV being the precaution by the victim and XI precaution by the injurer, right? So both parties can affect the probability of the accident. That's all we're saying here, right? All that equation is saying, here's what we got. We got the probability of the accident goes down as the victim takes precaution and as the potential injurer takes precaution. Okay? So the probability of the accident depends on how both sides are doing it, what we might call bilateral precaution. And if we think then what is the total cost is going to be, the total social cost is going to be WV XV plus WI XI plus this probability, which is a probability of X and I's precaution times the amount of the cost of the accident. So, is there a way that we can make it so that you get both parties undertaking proper precaution, right? First, I mean, and notice that both of those rules are simple in the terms of you're trying to figure out, let's say you have a suit, you're trying to figure out what happened, right? All I got to do is show who caused the accident, basically. I got to show that you caused the accident, right? Under strict liability, and under no liability, I don't have to show anything, right? We can come back to this in a minute, but anybody know how auto insurance works in the state of Michigan?
It's no-fault insurance.
Yeah, no-fault insurance, right? It's no-fault insurance, okay? So it doesn't matter who caused the accident, right? Your insurance company pays for it, right? And there's a whole there are, I think, 12 states that have no-fault insurance, and there's a whole, you can sort of see that where did the idea of no-fault insurance is coming about? It's coming about by looking at these optimal amount of precaution, and then what are the costs involved, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So what if we have a third thing, which is negligence? Okay? A negligence rule remember that when we were talking about a third characteristic, when we were talking about tort law, was that a breach of duty. Remember, that was one of the things we talked about. Is could you under tort law say that this is a breach of duty? You had a duty to make sure that you didn't crash into me. You had a duty to make sure that my property rights were respected. Okay, and so this breach of duty issue that we were talking about earlier comes in now. Okay, this breach of duty is a negligence rule that says, hey, you should have taken this certain amount of precaution and you didn't. I mean, that's basically what we're going to say here, is that if either of these strict ways of looking at it, no liability or strict liability with compensation, I can't get both parties to take efficient precaution. If I have a third condition that is basically a breach of duty or a negligence or some sort of standard of, we'll call it standard of care or standard of precaution here, that says if you meet that standard, then you took efficient precaution. So let's think about what if you had the injurer is strictly liable up until they meet their optimal X. So suppose we know XI, right? We'll call it XI star, right? Which is the efficient precaution for the injurer. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what? If you take that much precaution, then no liability. Okay? So we have a no liability if the injurer meets XI star. Okay? As long as so if we somehow knew what the efficient precaution was, and again, it was all these things we're saying, you know, we've been talking about all through the class. If you know what the right answer is, then here's what you ought to do. And then we said, well, gee, you know, maybe we don't know whether transactions costs are zero or whatever. Remember, we talked about tort. On the exam, you were talking about the idea of should you have an injunction versus should you have compensation, right? So if we knew perfectly what was going on, we'd know which to do, right? But maybe we don't know how many transactions costs there are, right? You got search costs and bargaining costs, et cetera. But we at least know what we ought to be looking for when we're putting the law together. We may not know what the perfect liability, the perfect amount of precaution is, but we might have a decent idea, right? You know, you're going 100 miles an hour through a school zone, we're going to say, hey, probably not, right? We're probably not going to make it 5 miles an hour, but notice if you go through a school zone, it could be 15 miles an hour or it could be 25 miles an hour. It's certainly not greater than 25 miles an hour. Okay? So we must have been thinking through, hey, you know, what seems to be the efficient amount of precaution. So if we know that, then we have no liability, and then we have strict liability if it's less than XI star. Okay? So what's going to happen? There's going to be a big drop in the cost to the injurer once it meets XI star, right? What you got here is you've got strict liability if you're going up to the standard. If you crash into somebody and you were going 50 miles an hour, okay? If we set the speed limit and says this is the efficient amount of precaution, okay, you were going the speed limit. If we say you got no liability if you're going less than 55 miles an hour, what can you do? You're going to reduce your cost of precaution by going faster, but once you get to, if you get above 55, now all of a sudden, boom, you switch from no liability to strict liability. So what's going to happen? There's going to be a big drop in your cost once you get to that. So if we were to draw that picture, under the negligence rule, if we were to draw that picture and you put dollars here and X here, and then I've got W equals X for the I, and then I've got the PXIA, and I'm looking at what's going on here, okay? And this is the W, this is WXI. WXI plus PXIA. Now what I've got is, boom, and rather than bearing the whole cost of the thing, right, rather than bearing the whole cost of the accident, all of a sudden, I go down to here, right, and when this is, when I got XI star. Now, I don't have any, this thing goes to 0, right? The PXI, that all goes to 0. So what will happen is, boom, I'm going from the two things down to just the one thing. And so you get this sudden drop in the cost. So what's going to happen? You're going to pick X star I, right? Because you have this, all of a sudden, you're going along here, and then boom, it drops to here if you get that, if you do that amount. So if we knew what the efficient amount of precaution is, if we knew that minimum, what would we do? We'd stick it right there. So if we just sort of think to game theory a little bit, we said, so now what's going to happen is that because you have this sudden drop in cost, what's going to happen? The injurer will pick XI star. Okay? Because then what happens? That switches to no liability. So basically what I've got is I've got a strictly liable up till the efficient amount of precaution, and then switches down to no liability. Well, we know then, since we've had law in economics, we know then what's going to happen is that where's the potential injurer going to be? They're going to be at XI star. But what do you, as the victim, know, right? You know how much precaution the potential injurer is going to be. So what do you know? You know, what's the rule that you know then? What we now got the rule for you? Well, what did I just say? You got strict liability if you're less than XI star, and you got no liability if you're above XI star, and you know that the injurer knows that. You know that the injurer is going to be where? XI star. So what's the rule going to be? Well, okay, what did I just say, right? The rule is if they meet XI star, the rule is what? Yes?
No liability.
Yeah, no liability, okay? So the rule is no liability. So you know that you've got a no liability rule, right? Because you know that the the potential injurer is going to take efficient precaution, so you know that they're going to switch from the strict liability to no liability. So now you know that there's no liability. But what did we just say? When there's no liability, what happens? The victim takes efficient precaution. Right? So if you are thinking through, if you had Econ 415, one of the things that we talked about in game theory is that you look forward and reason back. Okay? So you as a potential victim are going to be looking at and going, oh, I know what the rule is. The rule is strict liability unless the potential injurer meets this standard, which is the efficient precaution. And so I know that there's a big drop in their costs if they hit this standard, because all of a sudden they went from strict liability to no liability. I know where they are going to be. If I know where they're going to be, I know that they're going to be in this no liability rule. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to assume a no liability rule, and then I'm going to take efficient precaution. Well, you can do the same thing in think of so what we've just done is we've just shown that the negligence rule will lead you to both parties taking efficient precaution. Okay, so now again, if you sort of think through this, there's going to be a cost of figuring out what the XI star is, and if you're suing somebody, you got to have now you got to prove negligence. And again, and that's why we have no fault insurance in the state of Michigan. The argument is that it reduces this cost of suing and proving these things. But we have a theoretical answer to what the rule ought to be. The theoretical answer would be negligence, unless there's these costs that go along in implementing, right? There's the administrative cost of implementing what the law ought to be. So you can think about 4 different ways. Well, first of all, is that anybody struggling with that, or we got that? Okay. All right. So we can think of different ways that we could do negligence. We could think of sort of different negligence rules. One is simple negligence. Let's say we'll call this types of negligence. Types of negligence rule. One is simple negligence. And that just says, hey, what we just talked about. You have this legal standard that says you as the injurer are liable unless you hit the standard, in which case now there's no liability. You're not liable at all. You can have negligence with the defense of contributory negligence. And what that says, if both parties are negligent, the injurer is not liable if the victim didn't take efficient precaution. Okay? So both parties were negligent, all right? So you got a situation where both parties are negligent. Okay, so in this situation, the injurer is not liable if the victim didn't take efficient precaution. If the victim didn't take efficient precaution. So if we know what efficient precaution is for both parties, right, then we could have the negligence for defense of contributory negligence. So basically, you know, if you're the potential victim, you know that if you don't make the standard, what do we got? We got a no liability rule going on, okay? You could have comparative negligence. And in comparative negligence, you divide the cost of the harm. And the division of the cost of the harm is the proportion of contribution of their negligence to the accident. Okay, so if both parties were negligent, but you were, let's say you were going 100 miles an hour in a school zone and the kid did not look both ways when they crossed the street, they walked out in front of you, you might say, well, gee, but the major cause of the accident was because the person was driving way too fast in the school zone, right? So you could if you again knew this sort of thing, and again whenever you do this stuff, how you actually implement it is a burden, but we at least can think through if somehow it's obvious that one party is contributed more than the other party to the accident, then you would have them bear more of the burden. And then you could have strict liability. You could have strict liability with the defense of contributory negligence. Of contributory. Right, and different states might have different laws with different versions of this negligence rule. Now, in this case, the injurer is strictly liable unless the victim didn't take efficient precaution. The injurer is strictly liable unless the victim didn't take efficient precaution. Okay? So if the victim didn't undertake efficient precaution, then that's your defense. You caused the accident or you crashed into somebody, okay? But the victim didn't take efficient precaution, then you could say, hey, you know, I don't have to pay anything, right? So we got basically 4 different ways of looking at the negligence rule. But it turns out if you have perfect compensation and you have the efficient level of, that is, you know what A is, right? That's, you know. If you know what A is, if you have perfect compensation, and you know efficient precaution on both sides, then any of these rules, any of these negligence rules, you get efficient precaution on both parties. So basically, if you sort of think through it, you always have the situation where I can avoid the cost by taking efficient precaution. You know that I'm going to take efficient precaution, so what are you going to do? You're going to take efficient precaution, okay? So again, it's just this story of knowing that there's a sudden drop in the cost for you taking precaution, then I'm going to know that you're going to take efficient precaution, which means that I got to take efficient precaution in order to avoid the negligence, and so you'll get both sides taking efficient precaution. Again, I think in the book there's I think they might have an appendix where they go through in some detail about that, but just if you sort of think through it, that's what's going on. Any of these 4 negligence rules are going to work because in every case you know that the other party is going to take efficient precaution, and so you're going to take efficient precaution. Now, it turns out that what I just said is that it turns out that this is not true in some cases where it's an all or nothing. A 0 or a 0-1 choice, if we sort of think about it. That is, if you look at that you can either install gas shutoffs or a pilot light if the pilot light goes out, or you could check the pilot light. Okay, so I don't know if anybody's got a natural gas furnace. Anybody got a natural gas fireplace? Nobody? Okay, all right. Well, we switched from wood to natural gas. But what will happen is if the pilot light to the fireplace goes out, it shuts off the gas. Okay. Now we could make it so either when I'm installing the natural gas furnace, right? When the people came, or not furnace, but fireplace. When the people came out to install the fireplace, right? What did they do? They put in this shut off. Okay. So I don't have to show that if there's a problem with the pilot light going off, I don't have to show it was because they didn't do it right. They didn't do it right, or whether I should have been careful looking at checking to see what was going on with the pilot light or whatever, right? So it turns out that if you have something where it's not a continuous X, right? That's basically what I'm saying here, right? What we've been doing is having X be continuous, right? The probability of the accident is a continuous function of X. If X is 0, 1, you either did it or you didn't, then it turns out that there's problems in a negligence rule. But we don't need to go into detail of that. It's just something to have, in case you're now an attorney somewhere, or you're going to law school someplace, then that might be something that you would pick up. But for our purposes, that's just something that in the back of your head. The main point here is that a negligence rule results in both parties resulting in efficient precaution. Neither the no liability or the strict liability rule will result in both parties doing it. And any of these methods of negligence rules all have the similar characteristic that the other party can escape liability by hitting there's a big drop in their cost if what they do is they meet the standard. So they're going to meet the standard, so you're going to meet the standard. All right? Okay, so over the break, you might take a look at, hopefully I'll have the exams back on Monday. I'll definitely have your exams back on Monday. And we'll go over the exam. I've graded some of them and people are doing pretty well. And then we will finish the chapter 6, and then chapter 7 is the separate topics in the tort law. Okay? So, any questions? All right. Well, have a good break then.